Good evening, everybody. Thank you for returning. I would ask, as usual, if you are in a place where it is safe to do so and you are comfortable, please turn on your cameras just so that we can see your faces, and a bit more engagement means for a little bit more interaction between us as a group. If we can see as much of you as possible. Faces, sorry, that sounded wildly inappropriate. So welcome back. I have a few brief announcements before we jump into the brunt of our conversation today. Following up what I had posted in the Discord channel, I had overlooked the fact that President's Day is a federal holiday, and so I will not be available, nor will our speakers. So I will be canceling the February 20th session. I apologize for that planning oversight. I will be moving those speakers to later in April and just shifting everything accordingly. So you can follow along on the calendar that we have in April in the Google Drive for updates in that regard. Again, my apologies, but hopefully that allows everyone to have a more restful, long weekend. That's something that you are, if that is a holiday observed by your schools. I had also posted in the Discord channel about an opportunity to attend the American Society of Evidence-Based Policing Conference in Las Vegas, taking place May 15th through 17th. If that is something that you are interested in and available to attend, please consult that thread on Discord. I'm trying to determine how much interest there is and to better gauge what our budget is going to look like and see how many people we will be able to sponsor. It looks like it won't be as many people as are interested in attending, so I'll need to think through what an application process would look like so that we can make sure that all of those who are interested and available are considered for that opportunity. Finally, the deadline for the press release assignment is this coming Friday. If you have any questions in anticipation for that, we'll afford some time here to answer those, or you can send them to me via email. I would ask, recognizing that come after the deadline of the press release this Friday, after that, I am asking you to identify your research themes fairly shortly thereafter. So I'm hoping that the press release helps you in starting to formalize some of those thoughts and get started on whether or not you intend to pursue a research question or a partnership. And sorry, Stephen, bear with me one moment and I will come to your question. So that, yes, we want to make sure that everyone is meeting all of those deadlines. Stephen, I see you are graduating in April. Congratulations, that's exciting. And I'm not able to track all of the different timelines of each of our schools. So I had previously had us going through, let me pull up the calendar. April 17th was our originally planned date for completion, so I'll be pushing everything back a week. If those dates no longer work for you, you're still welcome to participate and attend those meetings. If you have other plans or have, no intention of being a part of that, please let me know and I can shift the deadlines accordingly to make sure that it aligns with when your term will be ending. Does anyone have?
And I mean, he might do it.
Okay, Stephen, can you come off mute and express what the question is?
So can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Very good. Good afternoon. How are you?
I'm well, thank you.
Good. So you had mentioned an evidence opportunity in May. If someone's graduating in April, is that something that precludes them from attending, or what's the story on that?
Oh, no, not at all. Because this would be a consortium specific opportunity. Let me drop that into the chat. This is the American Society of Evidence-Based Policing. They're hosting a conference. All of the information about this is in the discourse channel. And so I'm looking to sponsor the participation of a handful of students in that. So actually, it might actually be better if you have graduated so that you would have more availability to participate. The dates of the conference, yes, the dates of the conference are May 15th through the 17th. Any questions about either that, the press release, larger research? Okay, I'll allow you to ruminate while I am honored to introduce our speaker for today. Today we're joined by Jocelyn Simonson, which I haven't told her this, but I walked by her at a conference over the summer and had a bit of a fangirl moment where I was like, oh my goodness, there's somebody whose scholarship I totally respect and wanted to engage with, but she was surrounded by a number of other colleagues, so it didn't feel comfortable or appropriate being the total fangirl that I can be when I meet or see people that I'm really curious about picking their brain. But we're delighted that she's joining us today. Jocelyn comes to us from Brooklyn Law School. And writes and teaches about criminal law, criminal procedure, evidence, and social change. Her scholarship explores ways in which the public participates in the criminal process and in the institutions of local governance that control policing and punishment. She studies bottom-up interventions in the criminal legal system, such as bail funds, cop watching, court watching, and participatory defense, asking how these real-life interventions should inform our conceptions of the design of criminal justice institutions, the discourse of constitutional rights, and the meaning of democratic justice. So recognizing the wealth of expertise that she brings to this space, I'm thrilled that you are able to join us today, Jocelyn, and I hand the floor to you.
Great, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I do have some slides that I'll share in a minute. But I would love, I'm not going to make anyone talk, but if people could in the chat say hi and let me know where you are. And I mean that in two things, like physically, what city, state, country are you in, and also what school or community you're coming from. That would be super useful for me. A lot of what I think about is very, very local, hyper local even. And so even for me, like having a sense of place when we're together virtually can be really useful. So great, I see some coming in already. We got DC, we got Bristol. Where else are you all? Great. All right, thank you. All right, wow, all over. I'm liking it. That's so fun. Do you ever get together physically? Are you gonna have
Not at this time, no. The conference that I mentioned earlier might be an opportunity.
Might be a good chance, right? Or is that Vegas?
Yes.
Okay. All right, great. Thank you, everybody. It's a pleasure to meet you and be with you virtually. Thank you for that introduction. I am physically in Brooklyn. You can sort of see. I can't quite angle the camera. Now I've messed it up. I've stayed in federal courthouses out my window here. So I'm in downtown Brooklyn. I've been in New York City a lot of my life. It's where a lot of my perspectives on this stuff comes from. And I also was a public defender in the Bronx for 5 years, which is actually where I first started thinking about things like cop watching and court watching. I had almost 2,000 cases in 5 years, which gives you a sense of, how much time I got to spend on all of them, especially considering I did dozens of trials, including felony trials. But in the Bronx, most cases are misdemeanors, and most misdemeanors only have one witness, who's the arresting officer. And so a lot of my, I grew up with the NYPD all around me, but not interacting with them too much, sort of taking them for granted. And then as a public defender, I found myself cross-examining a lot of officers and thinking a lot about evidence and officer truth-telling and how much the word of police officers in a uniform is generally taken for granted. But in the Bronx, when you get in front of a jury, really not taken for granted because of the experiences of jurors in the Bronx. And it was when I was a public defender that I started to see groups that were organizing around New York City against, but at the time, well, it's still, now it's back, against broken windows policing and stop, question, and frisk policies of the NYPD at the time, which were leading to easily 60 to 70% of all criminal cases, easily. And what I saw was that in court, case by case, it didn't really feel like the right way to be challenging policing practices, right? It very much became about an individual officer. Are they telling the truth about what they said? Can you ever show they're not telling the truth? Not really. There weren't body cameras yet. And then I started noticing that groups were organizing to try to change policing practices, and that change wasn't coming from lawyers. It was coming from organizers, sometimes using lawyers for things like, there was a big class action lawsuit that was kind of movement lawyering against the NYPD. And so I saw cop watching groups around the city, court watching groups started coming into arraignments in court. And I started myself, especially as I transitioned out of public defense and into academia, thinking about the problems of the criminal system as not necessarily being about laws and policies, not necessarily being about laws or even policies, but as about being relational, about relationships between people in power and people in power using the violence of the criminal system and people who are being subject to that violence. And I know that's abstract, but hopefully you can see sort of concretely how I think about it in the context of policing. But I do want to just stress that I actually don't think of myself as a policing scholar. I think of myself as a scholar of the criminal system, of democracy, of organizing, and of sort of legal change more broadly. And so it's kind of fun for me that you all read Cop Watching, which in sort of my academic mind is a long time ago that I wrote it. And so I'm going to pull up some slides about the Cop Watching paper, but I also have a book that's about to come out that isn't about cop watching. It's about, I'll show you the cover and guide you to pre-order it should you choose, don't you worry. But it's about people organizing against the criminal system by getting together to bear witness to it in various ways. So it sort of bears a lot of the themes of cop watching, which is part of the reason it was exciting for me to revisit it, to come talk about it with you today. I just to sort of also spoil the ending about my own intellectual journey, is much like almost every cop watcher I interviewed when I go talk to them now, and the court watchers and bail funds and participatory defense groups that I studied. Through being in community with these groups, my cynicism or skepticism and cynicism about reform, police reform and reform in the criminal system has only grown. And so I am very skeptical that when you go to Vegas, I'm pretty skeptical of everything everyone there is going to say about what evidence means and how we can use evidence-based solutions if we're taking as a baseline the way that we currently measure things. And so part of the way I want to think about cop watching, looking back on the interviews that I did 7-8 years ago, is not just what it tells us about what filming the police does in a moment, but maybe what it tells us about what we mean when we say something's evidence-based, what evidence is, what we want to be measuring, what justice is, what safety is, etc. All right, let me pull up some slides. Also, if people want to put questions in the chat, you should do it anytime. I just might not look at it till I'm done, but don't hesitate if you're thinking of something to put it in there. Share screen. Sorry, it's possible I closed this.
No, please.
I'll get it. I just have too many windows open. There we go. Can you all see this? Yep.
We can, yep.
Okay, great. So I've combined a few slideshows, and I'm just gonna talk about them. You've seen the Copwatching paper, right? Okay. So I'm gonna talk a little bit. I'm gonna sort of assume that you saw some of what's in it, and then maybe talk about some things. Again, it's kind of fun to revisit something you've written and see what jumps out at you as something you want to talk about. And all of my images, I have the sources if anyone's curious. They're almost all, made by activists and organizers and things like that, including this one. You can tell this is, I think, from the Justice Committee in New York. Okay, so the framing that I want to start thinking about, which assumes that criminal justice is a thing that can exist and that we want to have, is to think about if we want there to be something called criminal justice, if we want to use the violence of the state to make things better and more just through courts and cages and police and surveillance, and we think that can work, then presumably we want it to work in a democratic way. Just kind of assuming we all want that. And we currently in our system have ways that we either on paper or actually do get community input or democratic popular input into how the criminal actors work or policing works. And I am sometimes going to talk more broadly because I really don't think of policing as a discrete thing that's separate from criminal court or separate from jails and prisons or separate from probation departments and surveillance more broadly. But pretty much everything I'm saying does apply to the police, who I think of as part of the criminal system, the beginning of it, the entrance. So we have juries, or even you could think of judges and fact finders. And that's going to be in individual cases. People are going to be arrested by the police. And at some point, they'll either be most cases where the police is the main complainant don't get a jury because they're misdemeanors, but at least you'll have a judge determining the evidence, or you'll have a jury judging the evidence. And with a jury, we have a jury of our peers. We have real people. Let me be clear. I'm going to sound grumpy about a lot of things. I love juries to death. Love them. I practice in front of them. I think they are the people who are there. The problem with juries is that we don't have them enough. Fewer than 5% of cases get juries, and misdemeanors don't get juries at all. But we have this idea that we should let the people sit in judgment, and that's how we're going to determine what's right and wrong. And not only that, we protect jury nullification. We protect this ability of jurors to make normative decisions about justice. And then, of course, we elect people who decide things. We elect our mayor. I'm in New York City. In New York City, we've elected our mayor, who chooses a police chief, who enacts policies. And actually, in New York City, police policy is a big part of what you run on. Our current mayor is relatively tough on crime, a former police chief, and he ran on the idea that we need to crack down on violent crime in certain ways. And the people of New York City elected him. And so that on its face should feel democratic, hopefully. We also elect prosecutors, and in some places we elect, as you all know, I'm sure, sheriffs and police chiefs and things. So there's this idea also that we're voting for people. And by voting, we're not voting on individual cases, but we're voting because big picture, we're taking what do we think justice means? And we're electing the people who we think. And so I've tried to present that in a yay, we have a democratic system way. But it's not that I abstractly think that we don't have a democratic system. It's that sort of on the ground in practice when I am in courtrooms and talking to people who have been arrested or talking to people who have been victimized and have tried to engage with the police, say in my neighborhood. There isn't a lot of feeling that there's representation happening. And so I see the lack of democratic, I see the criminal system not just as not being representative, but as actually also being anti-democratic in some pretty concrete ways. One is that it literally disenfranchises people when it gives them criminal records. Another is that when it puts people in jail and prisons, it separates them out from the population. A second is that there's plenty of research showing that people in neighborhoods that are more heavily policed have the least political engagement. And more political scientists are starting to say, actually, it's the policing that causes the lack of political engagement through something sociologist Monica Bell calls this legal estrangement. And then, sorry, I think I have actually a slide next. And then even community policing. And before law school, I actually spent a couple of years working in a community court that engaged in community policing. So I've actually been someone who implements this stuff. You know, studies are increasingly showing, and not just by experts, but by the people who are police themselves, that community policing might genuinely be trying to get community feedback on what's happening, but in practice tends only to hear, like institutionally tends only to hear the voices of people who already agree with what's happening. And so it tends to legitimize current practices as they stand. And so on the one hand, we have these forms of participation that don't seem to actually be leading to representation. And surveys are going to say exactly that. And on the other hand, we have mechanisms themselves that are excluding people from democratic participation in quite a few ways. You can't be on a jury if you don't like the police, for example. Never going to get on there unless you lie. And so we're excluding essentially half the world. In New York City, you're excluding about half the world. Half the world, you know, and then the half the world that is the other way are the ones who elect our mayor. Okay. So that's the background coming in. And I'm starting with the New York example, but as you hopefully saw, I spoke to groups from around the country. They're part of the way we have some quotations from the police in the early, this is from around 2012 or 2013, is because there were some whistleblowers in the NYPD at the time who were recording conversations before times when people would go out to enforce stop and frisk and broken windows. And so this is one of the recordings that was used in the Floyd lawsuit, which was a class action lawsuit targeting stop and frisk in New York City that ended up settling. And I find this quote really useful because it seems really genuine in some way, which is we have, so this is Bed-Stuy, it's an African-American neighborhood. And the lieutenant is starting out the shift by telling the officers gathered around him, we've got to keep the corner clear, because if you get too big of a crowd, they're going to think that they own the block, but we own the block. They don't own the block, all right? They might live there, but we own the block, all right? We own the streets here, you tell them what to do. And this was given as a pep talk, and you can imagine the pep talk behind it, right? There are criminals on the corner implies maybe they're selling drugs, maybe they're being violent. And so we're going to go out there and show them who's boss. And so from that angle, perhaps it seems understandable. But I think it's also getting at like a pretty deep truth. Like I think Lieutenant De La Fuente is being kind of deep, which is that he's saying the police are in charge. It's not, this isn't a democratic system. We own this neighborhood. The people who live there don't own the neighborhood. It's a particular stance towards the people who live there. It is the opposite. This is also a guy who led community policing meetings, but it's the opposite of community policing. And so even in a place where you're trying to involve, quote, the people, in practice, it's not that, like he doesn't say anything here about targeting Black people, which is what the judge found that they were doing. But there is a vibe, right, that police are in charge and in charge of more than enforcing the laws, right? They're in ownership of the block. And so it's against that people gather together to do things like record the police. Here was a Valentine's Day card. We're coming up on Valentine's Day. You can use this again. This Valentine's Day, love your community, watch the cops. To learn more about Copwatch, visit copwatchnyc.org. And so what is Copwatching? It's groups of people who get together usually with cell phones, though some of them still bring out big old cameras, which is how the cop watchers in the 90s in Berkeley started out doing it. And they go out visibly, often they're wearing matching t-shirts. I have some more photos to show you. And they walk along. They walk along those same blocks or those same corners, for instance, in Bed-Stuy, to show a different idea of who owns the block, right? To say that we live here, we love this community. And the thing we're afraid of is the police, right? It's a different understanding of what safety means, and what violence and what to be afraid of. There's certainly a long history of cop watching. On the left is a old police article, A Night Out with the Watts Community Alert Patrol. There they literally had notepads and pencils, no guns in Watts. On the right in Oakland, the Black Panthers did patrols holding guns and notepads. That's why we have gun control. It's because the Black Panthers were doing cop watching with guns. And then they also were going into the legislative sessions in the state with guns. So this is an old history. It's an old history. I'm sure it goes back before the 60s of organized cop watching. But now fast forward, here we are in the same, next door neighborhood of Skid Row in Los Angeles. And LA Can is a community watch program that's existed for a fairly long time. And I'm just, I did interviews with people, and part of what I asked were just what their purposes were. So I have a few slides with different purposes, but here you can see the t-shirts that they're wearing. The guy in the back has the clipboard, he's walking with his cane. So they're not walking fast, they're walking slowly down Skid Row where there are houseless people who are living and are worried about being targeted by the police. And they say our mission is to organize and empower community residents to work collectively to change the relationships of power that affect our community. So one thing that you notice there is that it doesn't say our mission is to hold the police accountable or our mission is to film the police. There's something else there, right? Our mission is to change relationships of power. Communities United Against Police Brutality in Minneapolis. Our overriding goal is to create a climate of resistance to abuse of authority by police organizations and to empower local people with a structure that can take on police brutality and actually bring it to an end. So what's the idea there? It does talk about the authority of the police and abuse of it, but it's not, again, it's not a climate of accountability, it's a climate of resistance. It's showing a different vision of what they want their community to be. The Justice Committee. This is a picture from a tweet of a Copwatch meeting. The 9 different teams came together to talk about what was happening in their neighborhoods. Their statement, we're building a movement against police violence and systemic racism in New York City and to strengthen and empower Latino communities to hold police accountable. So there we do have the word accountability, but still this idea of strengthening and empowering people. And those are the Copwatch slides that I have, but this is also a mural painted by Copwatchers that I can keep up for a minute. Actually, I'm going to stop share for a minute and just talk a little bit more about Copwatching, and then I'll bring up the rest of my things, but I like to see your faces, which I haven't in a sec. And so that's what Copwatchers are doing. And in the paper that you read, I sort of talked about a few different functions that tactic of Copwatching can be doing. In the moment, having people standing there filming what you're doing can change how you do it. A lot of professors can probably tell you that now, right? Every class now is recorded. And at a certain point you kind of forget, but it's different to be recorded all the time than to not be. So it might deter what you do in the moment. It's also going to, down the line, be pieces of evidence that can be used. But notice just that both of those things, I wrote this paper before kind of, well, I actually wrote a lot of it even before Ferguson, but even after Ferguson, and as the movement for Black Lives gained steam and the idea of body cameras gained steam and became pretty ubiquitous by the time this paper came out. It's different than body camera footage. because body camera footage is literally from the perspective of a police officer. And studies show that the perspective of a camera can actually change how you see it. It's also in the possession of people rather than in the possession of the police. And so in court, it might be subject to discovery rules in the same manner. But in terms of how it gets seen by the public or who has access to it, it's a very different story of who has the power. And just that initial decision to turn it on or turn it off, or to talk while it's happening or not talk while it's happening, is by the people who are doing the recording. And I think all those things are really important, which is why I spend so much time on them. If I think about what sort of a through line through this thinking to the kind of stuff I think about now, it's probably this, I don't know if it's a final idea or this idea in the paper about power, about what it means for a group of people collectively, rather than just an individual, to come together and say, like, we're going to spend our Saturday night with other Puerto Ricans in our Puerto Rican neighborhood or other people who live in Bed-Stuy. It's a multiracial group now doing cop watching in Bed-Stuy. I'm going to spend my Saturday night walking around, maybe walking slowly because this guy next to me has a cane, and having my phone, asking people how they're doing, and being ready to film any police officers that I see. That's incredibly powerful. It's an act of love, right? Think about the Valentine, right? It's kind of a loving act of your community to say, I'm going to try to work on keeping us safe. And the thing that I'm keeping us safe from is the police, but it's still something that I'm helping keep us safe from, and I'm doing it collectively. And every one of these groups that does cop watching doesn't just do cop watching. They do other things. They engage in policy fights, or they engage in some of the tactics that I'm writing about now, which I can tell you about in a minute. And so I think cop watching is exciting. I think some of the Fourth Amendment implications are super interesting, and I'd be happy to nerd out about the Fourth Amendment if people want to. I love the Constitution. I love juries. That's what's funny, because in the end, I actually don't think we should have a criminal system. But I think that these ideas and concepts are super useful and important in a rule of law sense. So if anyone wants to learn about the Fourth Amendment, we can. But I'm actually going to keep talking about power shifting, organizing, and collective resistance and contestation of the carceral state in different ways. So let me share my screen some more. All right. So just to get a little Constitution in here, you can see in the bottom right of this mural, it says you have the right to observe, photograph, record, and film the police. That's a constitutional idea, a First Amendment idea. If anyone wants to nerd out about the First Amendment, I've done some writing separately, comparing cop watching, or at least civilian recording of the police, to body camera footage, and thinking about the act of filming someone as actually a form of speech through the resistance and the power that can be shifted in the moment. Whereas First Amendment doctrine, sometimes they cite my thing to say it could be a form of speech, but more often it's actually the collection of literally the collection of the film onto the phone. So the fact that you are filming is what makes it speech, as opposed to the fact of the act of filming. I don't know if that distinction makes sense, but if anyone wants to talk about it, let me know. And then on the left, right, there's more know your rights stuff. When they approach, say, am I being detained or am I free to go? If they detain you, stay silent and demand a lawyer. But then the main photograph, right, is of a woman organizer speaking into a megaphone, having voice, and then behind it, know your rights, watch the cops, and a video camera. Okay. So again, if we sort of fast forward in my writing and my scholarship, I wrote a paper a couple of years called Police Reform Through a Power Lens. And I'm sorry, this slide is so not that exciting looking. But I have another element to it in a sec. And So again, maybe not surprising since I've said what stuck with me is power. But it struck me, you know, I wrote this paper before 2020, so it was striking me before, and it certainly struck me after the uprisings in 2020, that a lot of what organizers were demanding when they were demanding police reform was no longer a set of changes like body cameras or changes to police discipline or things like that, but was really a change in who has the power and who has control over policing and police itself. It was really a sense of like, no, we actually want democracy. We actually want the people to be in charge of how policing works. And so in this paper, I looked at a couple of examples of social movement police reform suggestions that seem to be about power. One was community control of the police. So we had some Chicago here, right? In Chicago, we have just outside Chicago. Sorry, I'm going back through. Maybe it was the, yeah. So we have one from just outside Chicago. In Chicago, there have been a lot of circling reforms, and actually one that did pass about civilian participation in policing, right? And one of the suggestions that almost got passed was this idea of community control, that there would be neighborhood councils drawn democratically that would literally be in charge of the police. This is not something police officers want. It's not something police captains want, to have the community actually have control. But it was a big social movement demand that again and again came before Chicago City Council, nearly passed a couple of times, and a compromise was passed instead. But still, the demand was not, here is the police policy we want. The demand was, we want to have power over the police. Instead of them owning the block, we want to own the block. Another example is the People's Coalition for Safety and Freedom, which is a federal example of a coalition of social movement groups. They have proposed federal legislation to change policing. And in that federal legislation, part of what they propose, again, it's not just a series of things. They want some money taken away from federal grants to policing and put into other forms of violence prevention. It is also about who decides where the money goes. So they've put into that federal legislation a suggestion of people's processes in which people will go into congressional districts and literally pass along the power in a participatory budgeting sort of way. That federal legislation has not passed, of course, but here's an example of what the People's Coalition is actually currently doing. So they have these, if you start in the upper left, they have these local base building organizations. They design how things work. Then they're doing survey data and collection. Then they're having people's movement assemblings. Then they're synthesizing it into a alternative to the 1994 crime bill, and then passing it along. Okay, power shifting. So now I'm writing this book that I'm going to tell you about for a minute. Again, trying to emphasize this through line from the cop watching to these acts, and then we can circle back around, hopefully, to talk about policing together. Okay. So I have this book coming out. You can, if you want to, pre-order it, but I really am just kidding. You don't have to go buy the book now. It's coming out in August. And it absolutely has a through line from my thinking about cop watching, although it's not about cop watching. So I'm going to tell you what it's about, and then hopefully connect some dots. So it starts out by thinking about the carceral state and how it thinks about justice and safety. And I think that we can think about this in the context of the police too, right? So if you have somebody, not to harp on the mayor thing, I didn't know I would be talking about my mayor, but apparently I am today. If you have a mayor who's saying, I'm the pro safety candidate, well, maybe I'll just ask you, if someone's running for, because I know I've been talking a lot, if someone's running for office, and they say, I'm a pro safety candidate, will you just put in the chat and say what you would guess that meant? Like what you guess they mean? I'm the pro safety candidate. Yeah, so I see harsher penalties, pro police, law and order. I'm a Republican, I'm pro cop, pro incarceration, pro law enforcement officers, tough on crime, pro-police, tough on crime. Yeah, an increase in police powers and budget. I think all those things are often, but not always, right? What people mean for shorthand when they say they're in favor of safety. They say they're in favor of justice. I'm not sure it's quite the same, but it probably has the same idea. But there's these ideas about the meaning of safety, that if I'm in favor of safety, as opposed to something else, housing, I don't know, then to be in favor of safety means to think that maybe I need to improve policing, but I am in favor of more resources toward policing so that it can be the best it can be to keep us safe. This is the court I practiced in, the Bronx Hall of Justice, right? If I say that something is a justice center or a hall of justice, what do you think happens in a hall of justice or a justice center? Put it in the chat. What happens in a justice center? If I'm the mayor and say I'm going to have a new justice center, what am I doing? Not justice. Thank you, Grace. Yeah. Okay. So I like all these ideas swirling around together. It's I already told you it's a court. There's trials. It's a court. Hopefully there's a rule of law and due process. So there might be this sense of fairness. But probably it means incarceration and jail too. There's this idea that what justice means is policing, prosecution, jail, hopefully doing it fairly and just getting the guilty people, but that's what justice is. If I say that I want public safety and justice for all, what does my political action committee want? More police, more incarceration. And so my book is about a series of tactics that are mostly inside courthouses. I do think they're about watching the police in a lot of ways, but one example would be court watchers. Here I have Copwatch. I think this is upper right LA, upper left Baton Rouge, and down on the bottom is NYC. In New York, they say not in our name because in New York City, in New York, as well as in Illinois, California, and perhaps one other place, the caption is the people of the state of New York versus whoever's being prosecuted. And so court watchers come in with these yellow shirts and they sit in the audience and they say, not in our name, we're the people too. And we don't think all these prosecutions are keeping us safe. Same thing in Baton Rouge, LA. My book chapter about court watching focuses a lot on this Baton Rouge court watching group, but also looks at Baltimore, at Nashville, at Chicago, Philadelphia, Boston, cities around the country that are increasingly, and sometimes they're affiliated with cop watching groups doing court watching, sitting, taking data on what happens, but increasingly, just like the cop watching groups, not talking about the courts getting it right, but talking about having fewer cases or not having criminal courts at all. Bail funds and bailouts. On the left, sort of an example from Nashville of how this rotating bail fund might work. I write a lot. If I've written about one thing the most, it's actually community bail funds. And I write about them a lot in my book, but I just to take a moment and think about how it's a little bit like cop watching and what some parallels could be, is a bail fund or bailout would be a group of people coming together and paying money to free somebody from jail, but it's somebody they don't know, right? So bail is usually, the idea would be that somebody's mom or family, or maybe their block or their church gets together money to help free them. And then they're on the hook if the person doesn't come back to court for that money. A bail fund is different. It bails out a stranger. And so in that way, it's sort of a different kind of Valentine. And they often do a Valentine's Day bailout to say it's a group of people saying, we think that our community is safer when people aren't in jail. And so we're going to bail people out and the money's going to come back to us and then we'll be able to use it for other things. And bail funds, just like court watchers, think of what they're doing just as a tactic and not as what they're always going to do. And so some bail funds will stop what they're doing when they think they're legitimizing the system. And increasingly, it is very hard to find a bail fund. A lot of bail funds start out saying, we're going to fix the system. And it's very hard to find a bail fund that, after trying again and again to free people, hasn't come to the conclusion that people shouldn't be in jail at all. Participatory defense. I know we're getting what feels farther away than policing, but I don't know that it necessarily is. On the left is in Silicon Valley debug. On the right is an action in Brescia Meadows' case. I don't know if any of you have heard of her. These are defense campaigns in which people are coming together to work on people's defense when they're being prosecuted. On the right, Survived and Punished is for people being prosecuted when they've engaged in self-defense in the context of long-term abuse or just as survivors. On the left is a participatory defense hub, which is groups of family coming together to work on each other's cases. And increasingly, these groups are also doing things like cop watching and court watching to come together. And when you talk to any of these groups, what they'll talk about is not necessarily just the individual cases, but the collective power that they feel that they're generating. And a lot of times that power is not just in contrast to the police and prosecutors, it's also in contrast to public defenders. To system actors who they feel are not representing or don't understand the communal point of view. Now we're circling back to policing. Increasingly, as you probably know or have seen, there's pushes to think about police reform, not just in terms of what the police do, but in terms of how much resources they have. So again, pro-safety, as we just said, is often thought about. Pro-police or more resources toward the police. And so one of the last chapters in my book is about people's budgets over the last 2 or 3 years, and how around the country people are getting together, much like that people's process. Not to have like 3 organizers in a room say how much money should be given toward the police, but to have lots of groups come together. So in LA, these are just some pictures of the different groups that came into the people's budget. We've been doing it for a few years now. They surveyed tens of thousands of people in Los Angeles to come up with the people's budget. We can talk about the process if people are interested, but here's what I want to show you. Here's the budget. So on the right is the proposed mayor's budget in LA, which is the police getting about 53% of all of the city's budget for the year, and fire and police getting 70%. And on the left is the people's budget. And what they don't do is use the same categories. So there's a public safety committee, which, as you can probably guess, is about police and fire. But actually the people's budget in LA has a different categorization altogether. So the pink there is called reimagined community safety. And so what that money goes to is actually not the police. It's to violence prevention, different forms of support, things like housing even, which again, you might think of being pro-safety and pro-housing as different things. But the people's budget is actually saying what makes us feel safer is housing, universal aid and crisis management, the built environment, and then they have 1.64% for law enforcement and policing. Again, this is coming from the survey of tens and thousands of people. Something you might or might not have talked about is that you actually get a pretty different answers to 2 different questions. One is the question, do you want to defund the police? That's going to give you one answer. Most people, or a lot of people will say no, I don't want to defund the police. Some people will say yes. Another question would be, do you think we should have more or less than 50% of our budget going to the police? And almost everyone is going to say less, whereas almost every place is spending more than that. So if you're asking about percentages of money, or if you're giving comparisons, like how much money do you think we should spend on the police? So in Chicago, actually, the People's Budget Coalition has this board they put out. Y'all probably can't even see me. Has this, it's almost sort of like a game board, and they have these different spaces, and then they break the budget out into like 20 tokens, and then they get people in groups and like distribute the tokens around the board to where you think the city's resources should go. And from that, they generate their people's budget, which has a pretty low percentage for policing. This is just a picture to show the collectivity of it all, which is that none of this is people doing things alone. It's all people doing things together. And let me stop the share a minute. I also see at least one question in the chat. So you all don't see my screen anymore, right? You can see me? Okay, great. I can see some of you. One sec. The way I made this book was by interviewing organizers and activists who are engaging in these tactics. And one thing one might say is, well, wait a minute, you're talking about the criminal system. You're talking about evidence and expertise. Why aren't you talking to police officers, to public defenders, to prosecutors, to judges, to corrections officers, to people who know the system really well? And it's true, they did. It's not that they don't know the system, but implicit in those questions, I think, is that ordinary people who are subject to the system can't understand it or don't understand something really nuanced about it. And I mean, I've been a public defender. I've had 2,000 cases. I teach con law. I teach the Fourth Amendment. I teach criminal law. And I can tell you that I really don't know more than people who are experiencing the violence of the system in a direct way, or even just regular people. A lot of court watchers are old ladies. A lot of them are old white ladies who have time. And especially in the last 10 years are feeling like something feels wrong with criminal court and policing, and I don't know what it is. And so they're sitting in court and watching what's happened. And just to sit there, sometimes you got to sit there for hours and just watch a few cases. Even just for one day, the ladies will come out. And of course, you're going in with a certain set of questions if you decided to do this. But they will come out with a feeling of not only was that not justice, but like, what in the what was that? And why are we calling that justice? It doesn't necessarily feel like something that can be fixed. If you're sitting there looking not one notorious case, like somebody is alleged to have raped 5 people and I'm watching their arraignment, that might feel like justice. But to go just watch ordinary so-called justice can actually feel like the opposite. And so I think of these folks as experts, I really do. And that's what I try to show in the book. But what's also real, what I also talk about, and this is something that I've experienced myself, is how much people's hearts and minds change, not when they're doing things alone, like sitting in court, but when they're sitting in court with a group in which they can feel some ownership what they're doing. These groups are increasingly starting to ask questions about what justice and safety is, and to come out with a perspective that's abolitionist, that's saying, I don't think this is the way to find justice. I think that there are other ways. And part of the way you start to get a hint or a sense of what that other way can be is through being part of a collective. So to go back to think of cop watching as a Valentine, when some of these same cop watchers who I interviewed are, they're almost all still in some kind of fight or some kind of organizing. But a lot of them have actually started to do things like engage in restorative justice outside of the system, or try to do violence intervention on these same corners without, finding ways to intervene, prevent, and help people who have been victimized without using the police, using energy and honestly getting funding that they wouldn't have gotten back when they first started cop watching. And so that journey from collective resistance to collective building of alternatives to justice and safety is what gets me really excited, like super excited. And so I'm actually an optimist, but I'm an abolitionist optimist. And so if anyone wants to talk about that, I can talk about that too. I guess what I would say, and then I would love to hear either questions or like shoot me a topic to talk about, because again, I've been thinking and writing about this stuff for quite some time. I guess I would invite you, as you think about policing over the next semester, to just ask. I'm not inviting you to be abolitionist, so that you're welcome to. I'm inviting you to ask questions about who has the power in any individual situation, who's setting the terms of the debate, who's deciding what success is, who's deciding when crime, quote, crime has been, quote, reduced, How are people measuring crime? Is crime the number of arrests? Is it really? Because who decides who to arrest and when to arrest and what an arrest should be for? What is safety? Is safety what you associate the word with? Is safety what makes you feel safe? Is safety what you get when you survey a neighborhood and ask them what feels safe? Or is safety something else? What's justice? What's violence prevention? A lot of these ideas are sort of taken for granted. And when I see that you're going to an evidence-based conference, I'm really excited for you because there's more energy and data being collected than ever before, and that's super important. But I want you to go in with your blinders off, sort of questioning the metrics that people are using to measure to success and to think about what works. That's my big thing. Like, ask those questions. Ask those questions. Are you saying arrest equals violence? Ask those questions. All right, let me see what questions are here and write in some more, or raise your hand.
I've been keeping track of the order in which they've been coming through. Just want to say real quick, thank you so much for that presentation and that really critical framework. I think it's going to be really useful as we listen to subsequent presentations and to think through some of the research that individuals will be doing, as well as potential partnerships. I do just want to say to the group, recognizing what we have just heard, the fact that we are proposing partnerships for our fellows. This is not the consortium advocating for explicit cop watching activities, unless that is something that is advocated and overseen by your faculty advisor. While I see the complete value of that, I do need to just add that little asterisk out of an abundance of do no harm principles. So in adhering to the order that I have seen, I think Stephen had a question first, then Lakshmi, Jaden, Sydney, Holly, and I will continue to track the chat. So Stephen, I throw it to you.
So Professor, thank you very much for your presentation. That was very good. I'm curious, with the reduction of police forces for various reasons that's been occurring for a number of years, law enforcement agencies are very desperate to get people. And as a result, some of their standards are being lowered, although they may use different terminology. That's essentially what's happening. What's your take on how this will impact the power that you were speaking of?
You mean standards as in like what qualifications you need to become a police officer?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I think it says a lot. I'm not one for formal qualifications in some sense, right? So you can think of me as a skeptic in some ways, but I think it says a lot that it's hard to find people who want to be police officers now. And I think it says a lot in different ways, right? Listen, if you think that police are how we can be safest, then that's really frustrating because you want to have the best people possible be police officers. I think to answer the question, I would take a step back and ask what it says about how we are all currently relating to the police and the way that that relationship is changing. So to flip the question, you know, I have a kid and I talked to her about policing. And at some point she said something about how police officers were bad. And I was like, no, let me take a step back. I think you haven't been hearing me right. That the best police officers, from my point of view, are people who care about either their neighborhood or their neighborhood they're working in, want it to be a better place, want to help people, want to take care of people, want to protect people, whatever it might be. And we want those people to be in communities taking care of people. I just don't want them to be police officers. I want them to be other things. So if the best of the best are deciding to be teachers and social workers and restorative justice practitioners and violence intervention specialists, then that to me is a good thing. But it's scary if we're still going to keep our police departments as big as they are. So I don't mean to like give a big hooray for it being hard to get police officers, but I also think that there are other ways to think about it. If I'm in charge of police recruiting, which first of all, I would never be hired to do, I don't know what I would do. I think that's hard, but maybe it's changing how you think about qualifications or recruiting. I mean, on our subways, and a few cities I've been to recently, same thing. There are a lot of posters really pushing police recruitment in different ways. Same thing, by the way, with child services in New York City. They're having a lot of trouble getting people to be ACS workers. Out of a sense, coming from social movements from the bottom, that they are actually can be harmful to families. So I think there are parallels too. Should I be looking at the chat?
No. Pay attention to, yeah, I would prefer that you pay attention to the screens. Next I had Laxmi. Your camera is off, so let me know if you prefer me to read your question. Okay. Laxmi was asking, are there certain situations where cop watching is not encouraged? And their example is in Chicago, the Cook County Jail houses the state's largest mentally ill population and is considered the largest mental health facility in the state and perhaps the nation. During a law enforcement encounter with a severely mentally ill person where cop watching could potentially be most useful, is it discouraged given the seriousness of the situation?
Discouraged by whom? The police?
Unclear.
Hello?
Yes.
Am I on? Okay, thank you for the very interesting presentation. My question was if it's discouraged by the cop watching
Got it.
program itself in terms of gathering evidence and in terms of whether or not that evidence is admissible in court.
Yes, great question. I was just trying to get a sense of which you meant. Cop watching is discouraged always by police. And I say that laughing because it's not literally true, right? Sometimes there will be specific rules. Like if you stay far away, then police officers might be trained to let watching happen. But if you ask them whether they like it, no police officer likes to be filmed. For cop watchers, though, this comes up in court watching too. First of all, not everyone wants to be filmed when they're being approached by the police. Could be for lots of reasons. Maybe they're talking to them. Maybe they're telling them things. Maybe they just don't want to be filmed at all. And so almost all cop watching groups have stopped live streaming what they're doing, as opposed to recording it, trying to shift power in the moment and protect people in the moment. A lot of them will try to really quickly get permission to record in the moment. So I say that as background. You're bringing up a situation where it might be hard to get permission in the moment because someone's in crisis, or perhaps they're not even capable of giving permission. I don't know how, what kind of mental illness we're thinking of. We could think of a big range. So during a law enforcement encounter with a severely mentally ill person, is cop watching discouraged? There's no rule of thumb, but people are very careful. And increasingly, the practice of cop watching is changing from being just about collective presence and filmmaking. Often cop watchers are there in partnership with some kind of a group that is trying to respond to violent situations and discourage police interventions, including responding to mental health crises and trying to help people without police intervention. And so they're not discouraged from being there. The act of filming can be a tricky one because some cop watchers will say, listen, if I can't get your permission in the moment, I don't want to press record, but I will be here, I will bear witness, etc. There's not a leave the scene sort of vibe.
Thank you.
Next in the queue, I have Jaden.
Hey, thanks so much for your presentation, Professor. My question was relating to deferred prosecution programs. I was wondering if you found those to be useful in any way, particularly in thinking about the court setting, and like you're bringing up basically, or basically as a method potentially of shifting away from carceral forms of addressing a lot of or certain offenses. And so basically programs, restorative justice kind of programs that take referrals outside of just basically, putting people in jail for certain things. Do you find any use in those kinds of programs? And currently they're discretionary, basically thinking about how we could make those mandatory in a lot of situations as a way of shifting away power from the judge to that being a community decision to mandate deferred prosecution in certain situations.
Oh, interesting. I like that spin you put on at the end, because I was gonna start by saying that if we're thinking about it from the sense of who's in power, there's not a lot of shifts. We're shifting which state actor has the power, right? So in deferred prosecution, a police officer has arrested somebody, and a prosecutor, either as a office policy, or maybe there's a program and case by case they're deciding, is saying, for example, one thing we have, I'm trying to think of the ones we have in New York City. I guess if you're accused of jumping a turnstile, there's like a community service you can do, or a treatment program you can enter. And then if you don't get arrested for 6 months or so, the case will be dropped without you ever being prosecuted. That's one example. Sometimes it can be more intense than that, something more serious in which there's an intense intervention, especially for kids. And again, the idea is that the prosecution is never filed, but there's some kind of thing that you have to do, some program you have to do. And the person who is engaging in that is not in charge, right? They're not getting power. It's not that different from being mandated to a program. It's telling you, if you want to not have this criminal case, you have to do this program. And so if we're thinking about it from the context of power, it's a pretty disempowering experience for someone who's been arrested for jumping a turnstile. So a cop watching group might say, how about we don't arrest the person in the first place? Or how about the prosecutor says, I actually don't know that prosecuting people for jumping a turnstile makes us safer. Again, you don't have to think this, but that's sort of the implication of the policy. But I think that teenagers in this city, in this metro area that has this these turnstiles, need help in some way. They need more services. Why is it that the prosecutor's office is the one that runs that services instead of it being something that's voluntary and not mandated? Would be the kind of question I would ask. That's not your question though. Your question was, do I see a purpose for them? And I think that they show that prosecutors in some places are thinking critically about whether cases need to be filed at all. And that's a promising thing for sure. What worries me, and this actually comes from my years working in a community court, that was all we did was mandate services for everybody, is that for people who aren't benefiting from the services or don't engage with it, it actually can lead to more punishment. And that it might not change the underlying power dynamics, the underlying problem, whether it's that you're a kid who doesn't like rules or you don't have the money to pay for the subway, whatever it is, that's there. But that's a larger cynicism about programs and alternatives to incarceration, as opposed to about that moment in prosecution more broadly. Because I will say, it is a really big deal to never be charged at all, right? That's big. It's not even that it doesn't end in criminal conviction. In some places, even whether you've been charged is something that you could find. So I don't want you to hear me say it's nothing. It's not nothing.
Sydney.
Hi, how are you doing today? Okay, so my question basically is about the comparison between cop watching and how it's effective in, sorry, not how, but its effectiveness in progressive cities that you've mentioned, like California, like New York City, versus like more southern rural areas, more where there's a bigger system at play than just law and order or crime and arrest. So I was wondering, how do you think cop watching is effective, or would be any more or less effective in a southern area where it doesn't really matter what a bystander is saying or doing than it does in California, where it's easy to make it more noticeable?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in part it's kind of an urban rural question, which I know wasn't the like, that's a thing, right? Are you cop watching in cars which is what the Black Panthers did. Are you cop watching by walking the streets, which is what you're able to do in dense urban areas. But I hear you saying something else about geography, about the South in particular, in which, first of all, there are some places where it's more dangerous than other places to cop watch, right? Part of the reason you're going as a group is because you're worried about retaliation and being hurt. But there are some places where even a group of people can be hurt. And I think that it's not always effective anywhere. I think there are places in New York City and Chicago where it's not effective, in so-called progressive cities, although note they don't have progressive mayors, but still we're thinking about them as progressive places. I think on a rural road, it's not always effective. I think in the South, it's not always effective. But I also think that some of the strongest cop watching groups I've seen recently are in Florida and Alabama, and places that are the most conservative places in the country right now. And so I don't know if this is necessarily about the political valence, as much as really being based in a membership-based organization that's doing community organizing and that sees cop watching as a tactic within a larger movement. Like Southerners on New Ground has a number of outposts. It's led by women and queer, Black women and queer people in the South. And some of the cities they're in, some of the counties they're in, they're doing cop watching, and some they're doing court watching, and some they're doing bail funds, and some they're doing participatory defense, and some they're not doing any of those things. And they're trying to intervene and take care of each other in other ways, depending on the politics, what feels safe and what doesn't, etc. And so I have really come to see none of these things as answers, and all of them as actually just the tactics that people who are engaging in struggle right now are using. And I think 20 years from now, we'll have different tactics. And I don't know what they'll be yet.
Thank you. Okay, that leads me to one quick second question, which is that nobody has the answer. And that kind of leads to like my concern and kind of my reasoning for being a part of this group is, at what point can we get to a solid answer? Because people can't continue to be disenfranchised, and people can't continue making the news for doing their job, and people can't continue making the news for dying either. So at what point do all these coalitions and research and trainings and people who are researchers, not witnesses, at what point do you come to an answer like, we got it?
Tell me more. An answer to what? Like what safety is?
Like to the whole issue. What is prison reform? What is criminal reform? What is safety? What is an idea of a criminal who deserves to go into a jail, like into a prison, versus a criminal who deserves to go in rehab, and it be beyond, you know what I'm saying, facial things. So yeah.
I don't think it's true that we don't have the answers yet. That's why I'm sort of asking the questions even more. But to me, the answers are more about, like, for instance, I think that we need to have a democracy, and I think we essentially don't have one, and that police departments are part of the thing keeping us back from having a full democracy. So if that's how you think about it, then I do have an answer for you. But the answer doesn't involve just slowly taking resources away from the police. It's about where you put those resources, where you give the love and attention, what we do with all the amazing people who want to be police officers, etc. So I actually don't want to be heard as saying I don't think we have an answer. I think there is one, and I think a lot of police officers could articulate what I think the answer is. They would just disagree.
Thank you.
Holly.
Yes, thank you. If I heard you correctly, I believe you said that your personal position is that we shouldn't have a criminal system, which would mean, no prosecutions, no jails, etc. So I'm wondering what your proposal is as far as, responding to historically what's been called, criminal activity, whether it's, something I guess you could call it, small or incidental, like, theft versus something, much more serious like rape or murder.
Yeah. So it's going to be different for all the things. So in terms of, first of all, if you offered me to be, queen to do everything, I would probably decline, right? And give power to other people to decide what to do. So just to be clear, is sort of like my vibe is not that I give the answer, but if we're going to go find the answer, I don't think they're that hard to find if we're going to look in certain places. So what do I think we should do with interpersonal violence, which is never going to stop, right? Human beings can hurt each other and will continue to hurt each other, even if we eradicate poverty. Although there'll be a lot less of it if we eradicated poverty, but people would still hurt each other. I think that's part of what you're asking, right? People would still steal from each other, especially teenagers, because their minds are tiny and they aren't very good at making decisions and they hurt each other. So what do we do about that? People in power are going to continue to abuse their power, right? Corporate crime is a kind of crime. And what do we do about that? And I think for each of those situations, there are groups of people who have been working really hard to find ways outside of the system to both prevent and respond to harm. Whether you think about it as transformative justice or restorative justice, there's an abolitionist group that has a website, I think, called 1 Million Experiments or something. And it's just a lot of little places that are trying to respond to, say, sexual assault in certain ways, which would be a quintessential crime of rape, right? And so I think for any one situation, there are experiments happening. There are nonprofit organizations, community organizations that are trying really hard because it's their people who are getting hurt in all these different ways. We're trying really hard to figure out how to do it. And so what would my answer be? It would be to take this, I love this, I'm no anarchist. It would be to take this incredible amount of money that we raise through taxes. I love taxes. And to shift where we're putting our resources, our research, our love, our attention, into these sort of sparks of promise of ways of responding to and preventing harm that we already have. And I actually could talk a lot more about that if people are interested, but that's the big picture answer, is that I think we have it. I think we have it. I think there's probably people who at a certain moment don't have the capacity not to harm people. And I do think, mental hospitals do sometimes need to keep people there, right? So it's not that incapacitation is never the thing, but that's not criminal justice. That's not punishment.
Katie.
First of all, thank you so much for this talk. It's really exciting and just really gratifying to hear your perspective. I am like only minimally familiar with cop watching. I've like watched some libertarian like cop watching videos from Florida, and but one of the things that I think is I've been really struck by is how like most of the stuff that I'm familiar with is like individuals with a camera choosing to have an interaction with a police officer and then like documenting how that interaction goes. And one of the things that is just truly incredible about them is that it's like a performative expression of the contours of what the laws are. Like whether the laws are like I am in a public place, am I allowed to be here? And I remember like watching a 45-minute video of a police officer just repeatedly asking this person to move along, but not actually having the authority to make them move along. And that I think is like from a legal perspective is really powerful, because so much of our understanding of the law is what happens in court, what happens in legal opinions, and what we read about. And it's very, very rare to see the law be like performed in real life. So I really appreciate the topic, because I think those videos are fascinating. My question is about expertise in research. So some of us are going to be initiating research projects rather than community partnerships, but I know for my part, thinking about, like, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're not still engaging with community organizations or like looking at community partners, even if you're working with them informally. So when you are entering this is a question for you, like kind of as an academic, like when you are entering a new area of research and you're formulating the research question, do you typically start with your research question or with their research question?
Yeah, I love this question. I don't know who the they is, but the answer is
Like
that.
in this case, it would be
Oh.
like, if you are not yourself already working with cop watching groups, like,
Right. Well, because I write about organizing. That's why it's like, I don't write about policing, I write about organizing. And so I start with the questions that organizers are asking, but that might not be what you're writing about. I think I have doubts about policing research that only takes data and information from the police. But certainly data information from the police has a place in the ecosystem of figuring out what's happening. I'm actually going to a conference on Thursday called, I think it's called the Participatory Scholarship Conference. And it's looking at legal scholarship and how we do or don't work alongside the people we're writing about, essentially. And it comes from this woman who's co-written with 2 incarcerated people an article about the 8th Amendment. And so they've co-written and thought about it together. And so what's the power in that? That's not just asking the research question from someone else, that's literally being an academic alongside an incarcerated scholar who's not formally a scholar. Then there's lots of middle ground. There's participatory action research, which is a super intense social science thing, in which the questions absolutely come from the participants, right? It's a multi-stage in which you circle back and you circle back, and the participants themselves are help generating the scholarly questions and the questions of like, what is harm, what is safety, what is a crime? There's a great participatory action research paper about public safety by Janet Moore and some other people in Cincinnati that you could look at. But those are just examples rather than answers, right? I've written about sort of how to write in solidarity with social movements, which is what I think of myself as doing. But none of those are answers as much as like you're asking the right question. Also, the thing that about the cop watcher just being given an order over and over again, that's the nerding out about the 4th Amendment I was talking about. I think that stuff is beautiful too. Or just, requiring a police officer to articulate the reason for something they're doing in the moment, instead of later on being given a checklist where you say, a checklist of things that would survive the 4th Amendment. But this is why I do actually like rights. If someone knows their rights and the camera's on, and this is where the individual thing surprises me, and they're with a group, it really does limit what even a person with a gun can do, officer with a gun.
Love the shout out to participatory action research. Would love to nerd out on that with you at some point. But looking at the chat, Rebecca has not yet asked a question, so I might throw it to you first and then go back to order.
Hi, I really enjoyed your presentation. My question was kind of going off another question, and then as I was listening, it kind of built into this whole theory in my head. But I guess going back to the role that prosecutors have in this system, theoretically, let's say prosecutors all decide in one state or one city to not prosecute this one case. And that trickles down to police and their discretion to arrest someone. How would that work? And how would that also go into the new realm of like police practices, but also making sure that, yes, they're breaking a law, but how would you also dissuade people from not doing that? I know that was like a complex question.
Sorry, dissuade people from breaking the law?
Yeah, like you gave the example of like jumping a turnstile.
Yeah, that's my favorite example because yes, because it's easier to talk about than rape. Although honestly, we could do the same thing for sexual assault. Is also a conversation I like to have, because talk about something that isn't being prevented by the police,
Mhm.
but can be prevented in other ways, like educating people about sexual assault, consent, and how to take care of each other. So I don't mean to say it's just about nonviolence. Okay, so let me start with when prosecutors don't prosecute, how does that affect policing? Legally, it doesn't. You can still arrest people. So they can still arrest people. If the person they're arresting knows about the prosecutor's policy, which is less likely than likely, but possible, then it might switch deterrence. There's a recent study, you all know more about traditional evidence than me, showing that there's no correlation between progressive prosecutors and traditional crime rates. Sometimes it goes up, sometimes it goes down. I don't think it's deterring or not deterring people that prosecutors are taking a particular policy. Either way. Same thing for policing. I'm not sure we have direct evidence that policing policy is affecting, quote, crime rates in any direction, especially if we're talking about a not arresting people, how are you going to measure this crime rate? Because your way of measuring crime rates is by arrests. And so already we're starting to circle around this, like, what are we measuring anyway? What's success anyway? But let's say we just can know with a certainty who is paying their subway fare and who isn't, right? You know, so to get around this measurement idea, which I don't think we ever can get around. How are we going to deter, oh, hi, kitty cat. How are we going to deter people from taking the subway without paying, without the threat of arrest? Anyone have any ideas? Any thoughts? Throw them out there. How could you stop people from jumping turnstiles without arrest, without the threat of arrest? Make it free. Yes, that's one way. We could stop charging. That's a pretty direct way. We could give, again, a lot of these people are teenagers. We could give teenagers Metro cards. We can change the way to enter into it. That is part of what New York City does try to do. You can make it harder to actually jump the turnstile, right? You can make them higher. You can take away the turnstile. You can turn it into one of those rotating things, not something you can jump over. There are a lot of ways to deter conduct. And so sometimes we assume that I do think policing can deter some conduct, but I think we're sometimes too quick to assume that that is how one deters conduct, when often there are other possible ways, including changing. If there's no fare, then there's no misconduct. So you could change the whole situation.
Okay, Laxmi had a question, but I think she stepped out. So Stephen, goes to you. For the last question.
Sorry, I was just going to ask you if you could speak to your experience with Brady and Giglio lists.
Sure. Well, when I was a public defender, I didn't have an experience with them because they weren't around or they were secret. Now they're a thing. So it's like Brady lists. So if you all talked about them and know what Brady lists are.
Well, I mean,
Brady is this doctrine that is actually an evidentiary doctrine about exculpatory evidence. So it's a rule of criminal procedure, a constitutional rule of criminal procedure that says that not just the police, but the prosecutors have an obligation to turn over anything within the possession of law enforcement or the prosecutors that would tend to exculpate somebody. So if you get into court, it could be then that a police witness who has done something wrong in the past, that could be used to cross-examine them. So then maybe it's exculpatory. Okay, so what's a Brady list? A Brady list is when a police department, more commonly, or a city or a county, more commonly a prosecutor's office, makes a list of here are the police officers. The way it used to be, it was a list, an internal list. Here are the police officers we cannot call to testify because they can be impeached with these things they've done in the past. That's one idea of what a Brady list is. There's a new idea that a Brady list is a list of officers for whom, if they've made an arrest, we're going to question the arrest, which is a different vibe. And then there's a third idea that being on a Brady list can be a reason to discharge an officer, because if you are not qualified to testify, then you are not qualified to be a police officer. Do I have personal experience with this? No, because when I was a public defender, they never gave us any of that. But then in New York City, public defenders put together a list of prior civil rights lawsuits that became public, and now the prosecutors have Brady lists. What do I think about them? I think it's a really interesting leap from actually a right that's about an individual's right, you know what I mean, to a fair trial. Now we've come to this systemic view of, wait a minute, what do we do when police lie all the time? Shit, that makes it really hard to prosecute sometimes. It's an interesting systemic leap that, again, I don't think it's a bad thing. Whenever individual rights can get aggregated in some way that has a systemic impact, I think, aha, that's a right doing some work.
May I ask a follow-up question? So you did 2,000 cases as public defender. You had to interview quite a few law enforcement officers. What percentage did you feel were not telling the truth?
Well, my feeling, I'm not sure matters, but there's a threshold of not telling the truth, which is like, I don't believe they all remembered what they were talking about, which is a little bit different, right? I think a lot of times they're sort of reading from the paperwork. Honestly, I don't know. But I had plenty of times where I was sure in my heart they were lying. But doesn't mean that's a large, I can't give you a percentage. But I had no proof except for just to cross-examine the life as much as you can to try to show how what they're saying is implausible. But does that mean I was right? No. You know what I mean? So I just don't claim to be a lie detector. What I did see is that everyone, that judges assuming everything a police officer said was true.
Okay, folks, we are at time, so I'm going to call this conversation to a close. I do see a few additional questions popping up in the chat, which I think is fantastic. Recognizing we won't have an external speaker with us next Monday, I'd say please bring those questions with you and we can discuss them as a group, talk through some of the good practice as well as the conversations that we have had both this week and last. So Jocelyn, thank you so much for being with us this evening and for sharing such a thoughtful, thought-provoking topic. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Good luck with all your projects and, stay critical. Bye-bye.
Thanks all.